Well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming. We got a pretty full house here, in-house again. And for those joining on Facebook, this is just brief overcap. Again, this is a joint Bible study with Christ Life, the ministry I'm involved with, and River Life Chapel, the church that I go to. And so we invite you, if you don't have a church, come on out Sunday mornings, 10:30. Roughly 10:30 till noonish. We are in Youngstown, 3474 Creek Road. So River Life Chapel. If you don't have a home church, come on out. We are studying the book of Job, and going to do a quick overview. We're finishing chapter 2 and starting chapter 3 tonight. Again, chapter 3 is loaded with meat and beefy stuff, so we'll see how far we get. Quick overview on the book of Job. Many people believe it was the first book written. Some of the reasons for that are no references to Abraham or Moses or the law or those kind of the promises of God, things like that, the patriarchs. So many think that, well, for sure the events, most believe the events took place prior to Abraham, prior to or contemporary with Abraham. It'd be hard to see God describing Job as the greatest in all the earth if Abraham was around. They'd probably be in competition with each other for the greatest in all the earth, So there's a lot of reasons that lend towards the book of Job being the first written. Authorship is highly debated. I tend to lean towards it being Job himself, since in the book he says that I wish that a book would be written, and then he lived about 120 years after these events, so he definitely had plenty of time to write such a book. I just before coming today, I spoke with a PhD Hebrew scholar friend of mine. We went to Bible school together. He went on, and he says that there's aspects in the Hebrew that are extremely ancient, and then there's some aspects that lean towards a post-exilic writing, so that to encourage the people in exile. Others think Moses wrote it to encourage the people in the wilderness. Bottom line is the Holy Spirit wrote it, so I'm good with that. For me personally, I lean with Job having written it, my uneducated opinion, but I know the Holy Spirit wrote it, so I'm good with that. So, all right. Job was the wealthiest and best in all the world. God brags to Satan about Job. We saw that in chapters 1 and chapter 2. And we jumped ahead and cheated and looked at the end of the book and determined that when we get to Job's friends, which is coming soon, not tonight, but when we get to Job's friends' speeches, we jumped to the end of the book and saw that God rebuked Job's 3 friends and said they hadn't spoken what was right about God like Job did. So when we get to those portions, we're going to keep in mind, because over the years I've heard people quote from the book of Job as if they're quoting sound doctrine, and they're quoting one of those 3 guys that God said was the wrong thing. So probably not a good idea to get your sound doctrine from the people God said is wrong. I'm just saying, Now, maybe you can get sound doctrine by doing the opposite of what they said or something like that, and we'll talk about that, because not everything they say is like the sentence itself is necessarily wrong. I think a lot of it has to do with their attitude is wrong, or what they say is wrong in that it's not complete. But we're not there yet, so we wanted to mention that. Job is a poetic book, and basically in Job 3:3, the poetic writing kind of begins. So we'll probably start to get into that, keeping in mind, context. If you're reading poetry, you've got to understand it as poetry. If you're reading, prophecy, that's prophecy. If you're reading a historical narrative, that's history. So just keeping that in mind as we go through. And we said, in summary of the beginning of Job, we said Job was a real person, not an allegory. Some people believe Job was an allegory. The fact that others in the Bible quote and reference Job as if he was a real person, the patience of Job, things like that. So you wouldn't speak of the patience of an allegorical figure. I mean, unless the allegory specifically says so. So that's the summary of Job overall, and kind of chapters 1 and 2, basically chapters 1 and 2. God brags about Job to Satan. Satan says, yeah, but you protect him. And God gives Satan permission to attack. So that's a high-level summary of Job 1 and 2. So we're going to finish off chapter 2. We got to where Job's friends come in. So if somebody would like to read Job 2:11 through 13. Anyone?
I'll read it.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm going to say their names right.
Well, that's okay.
11, correct?
Yep, 11 through 13.
Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, they came each one from its own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Nemathite. And they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. When they lifted up their eyes at a distance and did not recognize him, they raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. Then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw that his pain was very great.
Well, excuse me, what translation is that?
NASB.
Okay. I liked it.
Yeah, no, and it's good to get different translations. I'm usually reading King James, but the different translations sometimes give you different insights as to, and some of the language is more contemporary. None of the Hebrew or Greek changes, but like one of the words that came out when you read was adversity, and in the King James it says evil. So, it gives you kind of maybe even a better picture as if it were evil adversity. Okay, so it's, and with the Amplified Bible, that can sometimes, the good part about the Amplified is it gives you pretty much kind of every possible use of the particular words. The downside with the Amplified is you can kind of cherry pick what translation you prefer, so anyhow, so it's good to have different translations. And so here in Job 2:11, Job's 3 friends, they hear about Job's adversity and what all happened to him. And they come and they sit in silence for 7 days. So when we look at his 3 friends, verse 11, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil or adversity that was come upon him, they came everyone from his own place. And you can look up these Temanite, Shuhite, and Amathites. They're either references to places. Do you have that? Oh, go ahead, read it.
I have on here the 3 friends, their names.
Yeah.
The first one is as we know, they used to name the sons. God, his strength.
Okay.
The second one, son of strife.
Yeah.
The third one, little bird.
Okay. There's some different than what I had found when I looked them up, but similar. Eliphaz was, my God is fine gold, and Bildad, confusing by mingling love. That's kind of interesting. He's mingling love with his own way of thinking.
She mentioned strife.
Son of strife.
Was that the last one, Zophar?
Second.
Oh, Bildad, son of strife. Yeah, confusing. Yep. And Bildad is little bird. Zophar, little bird, you said, and I have sparrow. So So their names are interesting, and also the Eliphaz, the Temanite. I didn't look those up, but they're either I did, but I didn't write them down. They're either references to where they came from or which line they were related to of other people. So that's kind of interesting when you look at their names because, my God is fine gold. It's too bad your counsel wasn't, and then confusing by mingling love or strife, which these guys definitely brought strife into Job's life. And little bird, I haven't dug into that yet, but we haven't got to Zophar yet, so not sure what that signifies. But so anyhow, these three friends come, and they, where are we? Verse 11. They see verse 11. It's likely that Job's friends came. I have my notes. Job's friends plan to visit to mourn and comfort Job. So this isn't just a whim. They actually, wow, our buddy is in bad situation. Let's go and comfort him. So it seems that their intent was at least initially sincere. They saw the evil that was come on him. They came, everyone from his own place, and this is where the names are given and so on. For they made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. So, I mean, there's planning involved here. They didn't get a call from the hospital and jump in their car and run. They had a plan. They made an appointment together to meet, to come together to mourn with and comfort Job. It says their plan was to come and mourn and comfort Job. So it's probable that they were sincere of heart, at least initially. As we go along, we see they have a very self-righteous, arrogant, condescending, eventually, I mean, it goes to the old saying with friends like that, who needs enemies? But to be fair, we want to be fair. They made an appointment. They each came from their own place, whatever that meant. How far the distance? I didn't look that up. I don't know if they even know how far the distance was. I'm sure somebody has an estimate. But they planned to meet together, to come together, and to comfort Job. So they had an appointment, met together. Their plan was probably initially sincere, and they wanted to come and help in some way. But then verse 12. This, if we slow down a minute and really give this some thought, this is really incredible. And when they lifted up their eyes from afar off, they knew him not, or they didn't recognize him. They lifted up their voice and wept, and they rent everyone his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads towards heaven. So whatever these boils were, it made Job unrecognizable. They didn't recognize him. And these were clearly, supposedly good friends. I mean, you might be inclined to, feel sorry for someone you hear about having an accident, being in the hospital. Maybe someone I lightly know in Rochester, they're in the hospital. Oh, Lord, be with their family, pray for them. But if it was someone I knew well, I'd be on my way there, So these were good friends, and these were probably similar people to Job, probably affluent, probably successful, probably wise. They were in their own eyes. But they probably were received by others as elders, which would be people of wisdom and such. And later on, when we hear from Elihu, he refers to them as elders, and he says, I sat quiet while my elders spoke, expecting to hear wisdom. That didn't happen too well, but anyhow, so they met together. They came, they saw Job from afar off, and they didn't recognize him. The boils were horrible. I imagine scraping himself with potsherds was probably also not appealing.
With what?
Broken pieces of pottery, potsherds. That's how he attempted to get some relief.
Oh.
And the boils were from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. So, sit, stand, lay down. I mean, we'll see as we go through. Job doesn't get hardly any sleep, and this is bad. This is bad. So they didn't recognize him, and they rent their clothes and threw dust into the air and onto their heads. And these were signs of deep mourning and sorrow and grief. So it seems they were motivated by some measure of love to come to him and comfort him. And then when they saw it was worse than they'd heard, this was their response. So we're just laying the groundwork a little for these guys. I mean, trying to give them, benefit of the doubt, so to speak. I mean, and then they sat with him, verse 13. So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw his grief was very great. So again, they were in great sorrow, grief with him, and they didn't speak a word for 7 days and 7 nights. So if somebody wants to look up Lamentations 2:10, and somebody else would look up Genesis 50:10.
I'll look up the Genesis one.
Okay, and Lamentations right after Jeremiah.
Genesis one.
Genesis 50:10. Oh, okay, Lamentations, go ahead.
The elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have sprinkled dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. The young women of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. I am in torment within my heart, and it is poured out onto the ground, because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint in the streets of the city.
So that's showing that Lamentations was a whole nother Bible study, but that's showing that Lamentations is this great grief of besieged Jerusalem, the city, and they were in great sorrow. And so they sat in silence, they threw dust on their heads, and so it's just to show that this was a common practice of biblical times. And then in Genesis 50:10.
Okay, Genesis 50:10. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. Do you want me to read?
Just 10, that's fine. So there is that 7-day period, 7 days, 7 nights. This is another common practice of the time. So with those two, it shows the silence and the dust and the 7-day period of sitting in silence as for sorrowing and mourning. In this case, it was the passing of Jacob, Joseph's father. And so they mourned for 7 days. And so anyhow, it's just to show that these guys were honoring Job and coming and sitting in silence and grieving and tearing their clothes and throwing dust in their heads. These are acts of humility and humbling themselves, which they could definitely have used throughout the rest of the book. But so just to try and lay a little background on this, on Job's friends. One other thing, I'm just looking at my notes. One other thing that jumped out at me when later on, just kind of jumping ahead. Job was a wealthy man. He was the greatest in the world at the time. God brags to Satan about him. He was considered an elder, considered a man of wisdom, and so he would have been probably greatly respected, probably well liked. That not necessarily, but probably well liked, definitely respected. Back in those days, they used to respect their elders. Not like today, but anyhow. And I'm not just saying that because I am an elder now. I used to be a young man. Anyhow. But so they used to, so Job was that type of a person. These three guys came to him. You would think a guy like that would have had a lot of friends, a lot of, people who would have considered him to be a friend. But these three came. We don't know who else came. It seems that later on, at least one young man came, Elihu. He shows up later in the book and has his speeches. So at least one young guy was sitting around. But those are the only four we know were there, besides Job. And, so this jumped out at me that they came and, like true friends, gave their opinions right to his face. Other people probably were talking about him behind his back. True friend, I always say a true friend comes at you with the knife from the front, not the back, And I guess to be more biblical, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but beware of the kisses of an enemy. Okay, so try and stick with the Bible, that knife in the front back thing, that's just the Bobism. But, I'd much rather have someone tell me right to my face what they think than have someone stab me in the back, So these guys were trying to stick Job in the knife with the chest, They came to his face, they told it like they thought it was, and I give them some credit for that. I'm going to take away a lot of credit as we go along, but, I think these guys and most of the commentaries that I read, their initial response was sincere love and grief, Then self gets into the picture, and we'll see that as we go along. So before we move on to chapter 3, I did a lot of talking here. Any thoughts from Job's three friends coming onto the scene that jumped out at any of y'all? I knew I could count on you.
Can only hold back so long. Anyways, this is actually just on the side. It's not even out there. But from other reading that I have done, it's like in those days, it's not like they needed the telephone or they needed any kind of newscast. They had, like the society in those days, they were very quickly informed about everything that was going on all around. It was just the nature of it all. And so, all this bad news that's happening to Job, yes, his friends quickly heard about it, and then probably people were thinking, do we want to go there because all these terrible things happen to him? It may fall on us. But anyways, I just want to make that point.
Yeah.
That from the readings that I've done, it's like,
Well,
man, they would hear something and they would know everything that's going on in Egypt, everything that's going on in Canaan, and this and here and there. And it's like, wow. And now it's like, and people like in our culture today think that they those were barbaric days. That they had no culture, no civilization. But like even the way that these friends of Job, there was a whole etiquette about how things were to be done properly. And in those days, they had that kind of class. They knew that. Whereas today, should I not, whatever. And so, okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, the communication was not what we think of, like everybody's all isolated and that's that. No, news traveled. Thus the reason God included laws about gossip, because news travels. So, you want accurate news to travel. But even with this situation, they made an appointment to meet together. Well, obviously they sent someone to the other two to make the appointment. Otherwise, they could have just met together when they, made the arrangement for the appointment. So they sent one of their servants. So that kind of seems to me these were, also wealthy, respected people that, birds of a feather tend to flock together. So,
I have a quick question, kind of off the Job thing. Who wrote Lamentations?
Jeremiah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, most people.
Because it doesn't mention it in mine.
Yeah,
In his beginning of his book, it does. That's what I thought.
Yeah,
Okay.
most people tend to believe Jeremiah wrote it, and
Okay.
that's because of the horrible things going on and
Right.
stuff. But
Okay, thanks.
yeah, so all right. So we're moving into chapter 3 now. Job begins speaking, and this is kind of the onset of this dialogue with his friends, verses 1 and 2, Job starts to speak, and it says, after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed his day, and Job spake and said. So we're going to look, the next section, it's all about cursing the day of his birth, which is kind of interesting, just in connection with Job chapter 1, because his sons and daughters were celebrating their birthdays, and their day is what it says, and many believe that's their birthdays. And Job was constantly offering sacrifice for them, just in case during these parties, just in case they sinned. That's quite a guy. But anyhow, so after the calamity of personal loss, family, health, wealth, and most of all, presumed loss of God's favor. That's an important point. At some point, I'm going to go back there. I think the greatest thing Job thought, because of the way God describes him, I think the greatest thing Job thought he lost was God's favor. Everything else was was huge. I mean, you lose your family, that's huge. All your wealth, even if you keep all your family, you lose all your wealth, that's still huge, you know. But he lost everything. But I believe the biggest thing he thought he lost was God's favor. So anyhow, so after the calamity of personal loss, after the arrival and evident compassion of Job's friends, then Job begins to speak. So we don't know how long Job was sitting there by himself, but we do know that after they arrived, it was 7 days of silence, you know. That much we know, and how long before, I don't know. You know, we don't know how long it would take these horrible boils to disfigure Job in such a way that he would be unrecognizable. Another kind of connection that I see is, you know, a loose connection. But God brags to Satan about Job, says he's the best in all the world. Job gets these horrible boils and becomes unrecognizable. Well, Jesus was the best in all the world. And when he was beaten and crucified, it says he was, you know, almost like unrecognizable. So, and then there's more than one spot that jumps out at me from Job, and there's unbelievable, beautiful prophecy of the Messiah in Job. So we'll get there. I think it's chapter 9, but I can't recall right off the top of my head. And there's more than one, but for sure this one is unbelievable.
I was thinking that about Jesus thinking that God had forsaken him too.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point too. That both Job, who presumed he lost God's favor, and then Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? So, yeah, I could see Job in some ways being a type of Christ in some ways. As we get into Job, he kind of moves from, he never speaks wrong of God, but he moves from letting God defend him to defending himself, because he kind of thought he had to. So it kind of moves towards being a little self-righteous as time goes on. But when we see the counsel of his friends, that's certainly understandable. Some of the things those guys say to him is beyond belief. But anyhow, we're jumping ahead. One of the things that, as I was studying for this, it was an interesting observation. Somebody I read, I forget who, throughout this dialogue in the next 30 or so chapters, Job often speaks to God while his friends speak about God. That's a big difference. Some of Job's conversations, he doesn't have a conversation with God yet, but he's speaking to God. Some of it is accusatory, blaming, is like, but he never curses God, like Satan said. So we're going to get, so my thought there was, when I read that, my thought was, perhaps Job knew God while they did not.
I was thinking that earlier.
Yeah, it's possible. At the very least, they didn't know him as well.
Right.
And that reminded me of Moses versus Israel. You talk to God, not us. And Moses knew his ways and Israel knew his acts, So just some thoughts as we get to Job starting to talk. So the first two verses, anybody, any thoughts on that? Okay. All right. Let's read verses. We're going to read verses 3 through 10, but let's break it up kind of in the middle. Somebody want to read 3 through 6, and somebody want to read 7 through 10?
I'll do 3.
Okay, 3 through 6. Anyone 7 through 10? Okay. All right.
May the day perish on which I was born. and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. May that day be darkness, may God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it, may a cloud settle on it, may the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, may darkness seize it, may it not rejoice among the days of the year, may it not come into the number of the months.
All right,
O may that night be barren, may no joyful shout come onto it. May those curse it who curse the day. Those who are ready to arouse Leviathan, may the stars of its morning be dark. May it look for light, but have none, and not see the dawning of the day, because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes.
all right. So these verses 3 through 10, Job curses the day of his birth, but he didn't curse God. All right. So, yeah.
I don't know if this is spoiler alert or anything, but just in my relationship with the Lord, I have discovered that God is not offended by our complaining, that He wants us to cry out to Him, whether it's complaining or whatever. He wants us to share what is going on in our hearts. But in our complaining, like we might even kind of lean toward, Lord, you could have stopped this. You could have kept me from having to experience this. You are the one who's in control of all things. So really, Lord, if I was going to blame anybody, I think I would blame you. But I do it in the most respectful way. I know how to do that. But I have to share my heart. I have to complain. Just like a husband and wife, they have to leave room for each other to complain about things. They can't just act as if everything is just always perfect and always in that those moments of complaining, they can talk about it and resolve it. The Lord is so patient. He can handle all that. He wants us, even our grievances, to share it with Him. He doesn't mind taking all the blame for everything in this whole world, because He's the one who controls it, who uses all the problems and issues anyways. And so, anyways, I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, no, God is definitely not taken aback by our complaints. And He knows them anyhow. Even if you don't verbalize them, He knows them.
I do that sometimes. I know you know what I'm thinking, so I may as well say it.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, as long as our thoughts we take captive to the obedience of Christ, but we can share our word.
Yeah, and so the difference is the heart attitude. That's the difference. I mean, Peter and Judas both repented in some way. Judas obviously didn't believe Jesus could, would, or did forgive him, whereas Peter got over it at some point, I mean, so it's God's not offended by us complaining. I guess he's offended by a lack of faith, a lack of trust, and so, but Job, so far what we've seen is Job knows and trusts God's completely in control. And so that's where he's at. He curses his birthday, the date of his birth, but not God. So in verse 3, Job wished that his birth was, Job wished that the day his birth was announced would perish, which basically I looked up perish, it's vanish, be destroyed, be blotted out.
Okay, I have a thought.
Uh-huh.
And I kind of know the answer, but, so, okay, he's cursing the day he was born. Mm-hmm. Well, God created him to be born.
Uh-huh.
So isn't he cursing God?
No, I don't think so. Remember, first of all, remember, Job doesn't have any scripture.
Right.
So if Job maybe knows that God created everything, it's through, word of mouth, and, Job didn't know before you formed me in my mother's womb. I mean, those kind of things came after. And so I don't see him as cursing God's plan. I see him as in severe agony and suffering that he wished he was never born.
Okay.
That's kind of the way I see it. I don't see that as
Okay.
a curse of God.
Well, obviously it's not, because
Yeah, 'cause-
this is the whole thing, but
Yeah.
I just wondered. Okay, that makes
So,
sense.
yeah. And so, but he wished it was blotted out. He wished he wished it just didn't happen. That's it. Just didn't happen, And I'm going to repeat this a few times as we go through. And especially I find it very applicable to society today. As we read through, remember, Job never considers suicide. He never wished his mother would have aborted him. And he never considered murder. Like, I wish somebody would just murder me. He does say, I wish God would take me, but he doesn't consider suicide, abortion, or murder. He says, boy, I wish I was never born. Oh, I wish I wasn't here now. But he doesn't say, if you're my real friends, man, just take this and kill me. He doesn't say that. And there are other people in the Bible who do. King Saul was wounded, and he says, fall upon me and kill me, which didn't bode so well when the guy faced David. But anyhow, just saying. So as we go, Job wishes that the day never happened. He wished.
I'd like to say something else. We don't have to discuss this long, but it's interesting in the second part of verse 3. And the night they said, a boy is conceived. It's like they knew some things in those days that we don't know today. Like we have to have all kinds of science and everything to understand something like that.
Well, the context, it was the night of he was born. So, yeah, the second half of it.
That's a little different than being
Yeah.
Well, but he's cursing the day of his birth.
Right.
And so when he's born, it says, the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. So it's speaking of the day of his birth.
Oh, see, I thought the same thing.
Yeah. It's speaking of the day of his birth because this is what Job is cursing. So I don't know if they had any what we would call old wives' tale. It says, "Oh, he's carrying out in front; it's a boy," or it's, I don't know about that. But this particular context is speaking of the day he was born, his birth date.
This one says, may the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said, a boy is born.
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah,
That's quite a bit different.
yeah. So.
Okay, I'm glad about that.
It could be speaking of the conception, but it's not. But it's not. But it's not speaking of knowing prior to the birth that a man-child was conceived.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but the point of that is that, especially in those days, having a son was a cause of great rejoicing. And here he's cursing that day that he was born, which in a sense is dragging down his mother and father, because they were partying, they were celebrating the birth of a son. So this is bad news for Job. This is no fun and games. I mean, we're reading words on a page, but he was living it, and so that's part of what we're talking about here. So then verse 4, Job intensifies his desired curse on the day of his birth. Job never curses God, but he is venting great displeasure with venting his great displeasure with his situation and anger with God. So let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine on it. It's interesting as I studied this, one of the cross references that I found, it seems that Job may, or the Holy Spirit, maybe Job wasn't aware, but Job may have been contrasting God's decree with his own. So the connection that somebody drew was Genesis 1:3, where God says, "Let there be light." And Job 3:4 is using the same kind of terminology, and he's saying, "Let there be darkness." So Job is in such a bad situation, he's actually desiring, at least for himself, the opposite of what God says in creation. Just an interesting thought, that I stumbled across as I was, and they noted that it was the same kind of terminology that was used. So, all right. Verse 5. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. So here, Job desires that the darkness would stain the light of his birth. It's a poetic idea of darkness overpowering light, kind of like night overpowers day. At the end of the day is night. So in our cycle of things, day in the morning overpowers night, and night in the evening overpowers day. And so Job is calling for darkness, basically, to overpower the light of celebrating a son's birth, that kind of thing. Any comments or thoughts on that? All righty.
Just a comment in verse 4, the second part. May God above not care about it.
Yeah.
Like, to me, it's like saying God does care. He does care for maybe every child that's born.
Mm-hmm.
But here he's wishing that God would not care about it because he's suffering so much.
And he may very well be thinking at the moment, God doesn't care about me now. So yeah, that's a great observation that, the day of his birth. So verse 6, as for that night, let darkness seize upon it. Let it not be joined unto the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. So the phrase seize upon it is carried away like a predator does with its prey. As for that night, let darkness seize upon it. I wish this didn't happen, It's like a predator seizes on the prey and rips it away, takes it away, that kind of thing. And then he goes on to say that he wishes the day of his birth wasn't included in months, weeks, years. So it's just kind of removed from the time.
Exactly, and that's what I thought. Let darkness take it, and just skip the whole thing, and then when the sun rises, it's gone. It's gone.
It's gone.
Past it.
It's gone. Everything can continue on as it was. So he's in rough shape. Verse 7. Lo, let that night be solitary, let no joyful voice come from it. This is a pretty heavy-duty thing, too, especially for the time period that the King James says solitary. I think one of the translations that someone read says barren. Barren, yeah. And I looked up the Hebrew word, and it basically means sterile.
Yeah.
So, in light of those days, again, children were critically important, especially the birth of a son. I mean, this was going to carry on the family name, carry on the family business, carry on, taking care of, the mother, things like that, because, often in those days, the husband was a fair bit older than the wife, so often they passed away first. And you can see something like that from the cross where Jesus says, "Mother, behold your son, and son, behold your mother." So Jesus was taking care of Mary from the cross. That's pretty cool. While he was taking care of the rest of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so anyhow. This concept of sterility, another poetic method of wishing he had not been born. But this, lo, that the night be solitary or sterile. This anguish could be going so far as to say, I wish I hadn't been born, and if necessary, that my parents couldn't have any kids. This sterility, a concept, just a thought. I mean, not saying that it specifically says that, but that's what kind of came to mind when I saw the definition of the word used there. He's in pretty rough shape. He doesn't even, I wish I hadn't been born. But if it was necessary, I wish my parents were sterile so that I wouldn't have been born, that night be solitary, so anyhow, that was a thought that jumped out at me. And then verse 8, this could be interesting. I think we'll put most of this off for later. Let them, King James says, let them that curse it, that curse the day, who are ready to raise up their mourning. Somebody got a different word for those last two?
I do. Leviathan.
Leviathan.
Yeah.
That's the Hebrew word. Yeah. I have no idea why the King James translates it. They're mourning, but it's the first reference to Leviathan in the Bible. And Job speaks at some length about Leviathan later on in the scripture. Actually, I think God does in chapter 41. So I think probably a good idea to put off discussing Leviathan for right now, since we're in chapter 3, and it's kind of what we might consider a passing reference.
Can I mention something, but not to talk about Leviathan? Can I?
Yeah.
Okay.
She doesn't ask at home.
I do talk less, but still, may those who curse days. I believe in that time period, there was practice in all the different ways of, different tribal nations and different societies. They had professional people who cursed days. And so it says, may those who curse days curse that day.
Yeah.
Those who are ready to rouse Leviathan. And where it says, may those who curse days, I have a footnote, it says, or the sea. It's like, well, why would they compare or put together days and the sea? Well, the Leviathan lived in the sea. And so, but this here is just like he's pointing out, those who curse days, that's their job to do that kind of stuff. They should have done that with my day.
Yeah, and that is that I came across that in different when I was studying that he is saying, I wish those, like, it's kind of similar to Balaam and Balak.
Yes.
Balak hired Balaam to curse Israel, and well, we know that story that Balaam said, "Well, I'll only say what the Lord tells me to say," and to do. But anyhow, so Balaam lives in infamy. But yeah, he was hired to curse Israel. Well, there were people hired to curse days, and often days of battle. You know, if you're going to war with someone, you'd hire someone in advance to prophetically curse the battle day for the opponent,
Right.
And things like that. So Job's wishing that his birthday day, the day of his birth, we say birthday. When I was in Poland, I learned that they don't celebrate birthdays; they celebrate anniversaries of their birth. It's a little more accurate. We have birthdays. Well, no, we only have one birthday. Well, two if you're Christian.
Right.
If you're not Christian, what's the old saying? Born once, die twice. Born twice, die once. So, but as Christians, we have two birthdays. So the reality is every year we have an anniversary of our birth.
Right.
And so Job's not cursing the anniversary of his birth. He's wanting to curse the actual day he was born,
Right.
that it wouldn't have happened. So there's the first mention of Leviathan, and we'll definitely talk about that later on. And Job, a whole lot to talk about here, so we're going to kind of pass by that for now, because I do want to at least finish 9 and 10, because this is Job cursing his birth. 9, let the stars of twilight thereof be dark, let it look for light, but have none, neither let it see the dawning of the day. So another poetic wish that he hadn't, that he wasn't born. The stars of the night aren't giving, he wished didn't have any light. Just back to that blotting it all out. No light, no stars, no moon, nothing giving any light. And then kind of interesting, the dawning of the day literally means eyelashes of morning.
Mine's got eyelids of the dawn.
Eyelids of the dawn. There you go. That's the literal, basically it literally means the eyelashes of the morning or eyelids of the dawn. And let me see what my note says. Basically it's just like as the dawn comes, you see those big rays, and so it's kind of descriptive, and again, this is poetic, and it's I think I didn't write it down. I think I read it was a way of describing the morning, the dawn,
The first
rays of dawn, like the eyelashes of the morning. So that's cool. One of the translations says eyelids of the morning.
New King James.
New King James. There you go. So that's cool.
Now when you see the rays, not
Yeah,
the eyelashes.
yeah. There you go. There you go. And then verse 10 says that because it shut not up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hid sorrow from mine eyes. Still cursing his birth. My mother's womb, not only does Job wish he had not been born, but not even conceived, because you could be conceived and have a miscarriage, He's like, shutting up my mother's womb, I wish that had been happened, which goes back to the sterility and him kind of almost cursing his mother and father for having him. He doesn't quite say that, but it's why didn't you shut my mother's womb? And so if somebody wants to look up 1 Samuel 1:5, well, actually, I got it. We'll save some time.
just one second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Personalizing verse 10 we were born, and the fact that we were born, we now will see trouble in our lives. That is, like, sooner or later, all of us experience that. So in that way, I can kind of relate a little bit to how he's feeling. Because, like, life can be really good, but it can also be very disappointing.
Yeah. So 1 Samuel 1:5 says, "But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb." So Job is basically wishing his mother had been barren. You know, not sure how Job's siblings felt about that idea, but Job is in such a bad situation. He really, really wishes he was non-existent. And so I think we'll leave it there and start with Job 3:11 next week. Just before we wrap it up, any final thoughts? Anything?
Thinking of this, I finished chapter 3 this week, and it's like this deep torment that he's in his spirit, in his soul. I keep going back to Christ. Being in such torment, he sweated blood.
Yeah.
Being in such torment, he cried out, "Take this cup."
Yeah.
That's all I keep thinking of with the depth of Job's suffering.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a great analogy. I mean, I've studied Job many times over the years, but this time I'm starting to get a little more glimpse of the type of Christ in some ways.
Right.
Job definitely is not a type of Christ in other ways, but
It's like he's describing the same circumstances.
yeah, similar agony and really the pains and suffering of Christ. And, to me, I've always been convinced that the greatest suffering Jesus ever had was when his Father turned his back on him. Whips were bad, nails were bad, thorn crowns were bad, all of that was bad. But when God put the sins of the world on him, my
His head
sins,
from it.
and they had to look away from him because he can't look on
Good,
sin.
right.
Wow.
Yeah.
And never have been alone before.
Never been separated. Yep. So, anyhow, when I talk about Jesus, folks, sometimes I tear up. Don't like it, oh well. All right, we're done for this week. Thank you for tuning in, and Lord willing, we'll see you next week.